September 2024. While on a routine patrol of the Aleutian Islands, the crew of US Coast Guard Cutler Alex Haley noticed something strange. A Russian naval vessel just 30 miles southeast of Amukta Pass, Alaska, well within the 200-mile exclusive US economic zone. For the crew on board, this type of incident is becoming a regular occurrence. Just a few months earlier, they spotted Chinese naval boats also patrolling in US waters, running military exercises, sometimes in partnership with the Russians. Rapidly rising sea levels are suddenly making Alaska one of the most important US states. As ice recedes, new shipping lanes like the Northern Sea Route become viable, reducing travel time and costs between Asia, Europe, and North America, attracting global interest. What's more is the melting ice exposes vast reserves of oil, gas, and minerals, prompting countries, including the United States, Russia, and China, to assert themselves and rush into the Arctic. Arctic vessel traffic is growing rapidly, and the number of ships operating in the area has grown by over 30% in just the last 10 years. Alaska's capital, Anchorage, is perfectly placed to take advantage of this, both for its own economic benefit and for the safety of the nation. In the past, Alaska's geography was often shunned by the rest of the United States, being called a polar bear garden or a useless frozen wasteland. But this is all beginning to change. Since 2022, more and more money is being sent from the US government to the Arctic state every year. The plan is to expand the state's infrastructure, upgrade its military capacity, and the US Department of Defense is even seeking to build a nuclear power plant at Eielson Air Force Base. Whilst it may seem counterintuitive that a relatively isolated state is getting so much attention, Alaska is much nearer to some of America's key strategic interests than you may initially think. In fact, its capital Anchorage is the nearest large US city to Beijing, Moscow, and Tokyo. Its growing geopolitical worth is also being complemented by what it's got brewing underneath the surface. Alaska is one of the wealthiest US states, largely due to its vast natural resources. The extraction and utilization of whale oil, fur, gold, fish, and petroleum have collectively generated hundreds of billions of dollars in profit over the years. But resource extraction isn't just crucial for Alaska's own wealth, it's also been incredibly important for the United States' security. Since 1959, Alaskan oil production has accounted for over $180 billion and accounts for almost 85% of the state's budget. This has allowed Alaska to completely erase state sales tax and income tax and receive universal basic income every year from their permanent fund. With the Arctic opening up and global powers jockeying for control, Alaska is suddenly at the heart of America's future. So let's take a look at why Alaska is quickly becoming America's most important state. Before we start, I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's video, Enquiries. When you use the internet, your data will have ended up all around the web when you make online purchases or create accounts. What's worse is that this data is actually being collected by brokers who are analysing and selling it to buyers all over the planet. I've had my data stolen in the past, and trust me, it's not fun, and it involves endless hassle trying to fix it. There are specific websites where people can directly find your information, and all someone needs to do is input your name and get access to information like your address, phone numbers, employment, and even info on your children. Which is why Enquiries is such an important service, as it removes all the data from brokers on your behalf. This process is 100% automated, and all you have to do is create an account, grant them access to work on your behalf, and then kick back and watch as your data disappears, and the amount of spam you receive drops to zero. It's really that easy, and all you need to do is visit enquiries.com/invisiblehand and use the code INVISIBLEHAND at checkout. This will get you a special 60% off an annual plan, so check the link in the description to get started. Today, Alaska is one of America's most valuable pieces of real estate, but its journey actually began in the hands of one of America's oldest rivals, Russia. Primarily driven by the fur trade, Russian explorers began to travel between modern-day Russia and Alaska, with the first successful voyage across this body of water being made by Vitus Bering, also claiming the strait's naming rights. His voyage revealed vast untapped natural resources, especially sea otter pelts, which were highly valued in the international fur market. Russian fur traders soon followed, establishing trading posts and settlements along the coast. And by the late 18th century, the Russian-American Company, a state-sponsored monopoly, was governing Russian interests in Alaska and was making a lot of money harvesting fur. But what started off as such a lucrative discovery quickly turned into a liability. The fur trade which spawned the expansion had declined significantly from overhunting, and the sheer size of Russia and its growing military endeavours in Europe meant that not only were they short of cash, but they were unable to defend an empire which now stretched nearly 5,000 miles from point to point. Russia feared it was only a matter of time before Alaska would be stolen by a power like Britain. Preempting this, they made what was at the time seen as a smart business move, selling the piece of icy wasteland to the United States for the slash price of $7.2 million in 1867, which in today's money works out to around 150 million. To put that into perspective, 150 million today could buy you a high-end office block in a city like London and New York, not an entire state. And what made this even more of a bargain for America was the first major gold discoveries in the 1880s, flooding the state with capital and people. By the end of the gold rush, Alaska's value was starting to become more apparent. And by the time America entered World War II, it was emerging as a key strategic hub. Alaska's proximity to Asia, in particular Japan, made it strategically crucial during World War II. As the closest US territory to Japan, Alaska served as a potential frontline in the Pacific Theater. Its location also made it an ideal spot for launching air patrols to detect and counter any Japanese movements toward North America. Investment quickly flowed into the state, setting up military bases near Anchorage. The government also constructed the Alaska Highway, a 1,500-mile piece of road that connected Alaska to the contiguous United States through Canada, to provide a land supply route for military equipment and personnel. The Cold War once again made the territory even more valuable as a frontline defense location against potential Soviet threats, and the US military continued to expand its presence in Alaska, building and upgrading air bases, radar installations, and missile defense systems. At this point, Alaska had turned from a useless wasteland into a key strategic outlook, but the state's value changed again in 1968. People knew that there was oil in Alaska after a few small discoveries in the early 1900s, but no one really knew just how much there was. In March 1968, the Atlantic Richfield Company and Humboldt Oil drilled an exploratory well known as the Prudhoe Bay State No. 1 on Alaska's North Slope. After drilling down to around 8,000 feet, they encountered a massive reservoir of oil. With petroleum production from the lower 48 states entering a decline, a new oil discovery at Prudhoe Bay gave the US the opportunity for a significant new source of competitive domestic supply on a world-class scale, also acting as a key element in reducing their dependency from other countries. Initially, the oil find was estimated at 9.6 billion barrels, instantly making it the largest oil field discovery in US history. Despite high costs, the hostile climate and logistical challenges, the supply from Prudhoe Bay came online in 1977, offsetting most of the decline in the lower 48 supply through the mid-1980s. To show how much of an impact this really made, take a look at this graph. Almost overnight, the state's production went from here to here. And to make sure it was all transported, they constructed the Trans-Alaska Pipeline in 1977, spanning approximately 800 miles, transporting oil from Prudhoe Bay to the port of Valdez. This discovery would bring in billions to the state over the next decades, but its importance was about much more than just making money for the state. Oil is the black gold which makes the world go round, and it's at the centre of nearly every aspect of daily life, providing the primary energy source for transportation, manufacturing, and other essential activities. In the 1970s, US oil production was at its peak, pumping nearly 10 million barrels per day. But by 2011, oil extraction had dropped by 50% to about 5 million barrels per day, while consumption had risen to around 15 million barrels per day. This created a dependence on foreign oil, requiring the US to import 10 million barrels daily from other countries. The world's oil supply is dominated by a few key players, namely the United States, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and a few others, which together account for most of global production. Now, if you know anything about the relationships between the United States and some of these countries, then you know that they haven't always been on the best terms. Even Saudi Arabia, who has been an American ally for decades, has recently been making moves which may alarm some in the USA. Now more than ever, the US is focusing on reducing its dependence on foreign oil by boosting domestic production. Between 2012 and 2023, US oil production increased significantly, from approximately 6 million barrels per day to an estimated 12 million barrels. This surge reshaped the global oil market and strengthened the US's economic and strategic position. Today, the United States is the world's leading oil producer, generating around 12.8 million barrels every day. And while much of this production focuses on the continental US, the impact directly extends to Alaska, a vital player in America's quest to solidify its role as a global leader in oil production. Recently, the Biden administration approved a major new oil drilling project in Alaska, setting the stage for the largest oil development the region has seen in decades. He gave the green light to the $8 billion Willow project, led by oil giant ConocoPhillips, which drills in Alaska's far north, within the National Petroleum Reserve. This project is expected to produce up to 180,000 barrels of oil per day, and marked a swift reversal from previous policies which banned drilling in the area. You may be thinking this doesn't sound like a lot, and you'd be right. Compared to a state like Texas, this output is relatively small. This presents a bit of a problem for Alaska, as their dependence on oil is significant, and it has been a cornerstone of the state's economy since the discovery of the Prudhoe Bay oil field. Since then, oil production has contributed up to 90% of the state's unrestricted general fund revenues, totaling over $180 billion since Alaska achieved statehood. But this is where Alaska has a trick up its sleeve. Even though oil production in mainland Alaska is falling, the areas surrounding the state are extremely lucrative, with an abundance of natural resources in the region. It's estimated that 13% of the undiscovered oil and 30% of the gas worldwide is in the region, along with a host of other resources. As a result, Arctic nations, including the US, have become very interested in tapping into these to facilitate economic growth and generate revenue, especially as the retreat of sea ice and glacial melt is making these resources more and more accessible. It's no secret that pretty much every nation that is near the Arctic wants a piece of the action, and everyone that can has made claims beyond their exclusive economic zones on the outer continental shelf, so that they have exclusive right to exploit these resources. The problem is that many of these claims overlap, complicating the UN's ability to judge in a manner satisfactory to all the claimants. And this has given rise to friction among the nations, as they increasingly confront each other for a slice of the cake. This is where Alaska really comes into its own. In testimony before Congress in 1935, General Billy Mitchell stated, "Alaska is the most strategic place on Earth." This seemed far-fetched at the time, but a statement made almost 100 years ago looks like it's coming true. The reason is that Alaska is the closest US location to the center of the Northern Hemisphere. The state is singularly closer to many national capitals than most points in the lower 48 states, which makes Alaska the perfect power projection platform for the United States from a military standpoint. Echoing Mitchell's view, David Crum, the Air Force leader in Alaska, emphasized that by looking at the globe from above, it quickly becomes clear how all locations in the Northern Hemisphere are close to Alaska, noting that it's closer to Tokyo than Hawaii and closer to Moscow than Washington, D.C. In military strategy, holding the high ground has long been essential for defense and advancement. Recognizing Alaska's strategic value as such a high ground, Japan occupied several of the Aleutian Islands during World War II to prevent attacks across the northern Pacific. Since then, Alaska's strategic significance has evolved in multiple ways. As Alaska sits on the Bering Strait choke point and the Great Circle routes between North America and Asia, it is critical to America's economic and national security. The air lanes and sea lanes of the Great Circle routes are heavily trafficked by shipping companies because they shorten the distance between the two continents, saving time and money. Consequently, Anchorage and Alaska are at the center of existing commercial shipping lanes between east and west. Anchorage, roughly the halfway point between the major commerce centers of North America and Asia, is an important hub for international corporations like Federal Express and DHL, especially as nations like China and Russia routinely use these routes for their economic benefit. Today, the ongoing retreat of Arctic ice due to climate change is not only reshaping the region's physical environment, but also amplifying Alaska's strategic significance in both economic and geopolitical terms. As ice coverage diminishes, two historic shipping lanes, the Northern Sea Route along Russia's Arctic coastline and the legendary Northwest Passage through the Canadian Arctic archipelago, are becoming increasingly accessible to global commerce. The Northern Sea Route, in particular, has seen a surge in activity. For shipping companies, navigating this route cuts thousands of miles off traditional passages between Asia and Europe, offering substantial savings in fuel, labour, and insurance costs. Russia, recognizing the value of this corridor, actively facilitates and capitalizes on this traffic with its formidable fleet of icebreakers, charging escort fees that effectively serve as tolls. Meanwhile, the Northwest Passage, once deemed almost mythical for its inaccessibility, is also becoming a realistic option for shippers seeking to reduce transit times and costs. This emerging viability of Arctic routes marks a new era in global shipping, with Alaska positioned at the crossroads of these developments. As a gateway to the Arctic, Alaska's ports and infrastructure are poised to play a crucial role in managing and supporting this surge in maritime activity, cementing the state's significance. While much of the passage remains difficult due to heavy ice packs, continued ice retreat could make this route feasible in the future, and Alaska's position on the east side of the Bering Strait places the state centrally at the choke point of both routes. Over the past 5 years, Russia has aggressively expanded its military capabilities in the Arctic, aiming to secure its claims and interests in the region. Typically, increased human activity leads to a higher possibility of friction, as countries compete to exploit natural resources and economic prospects. Incidentally, what makes the Great Circle route advantageous for shipping also makes it the preferred route for missiles aimed at North America. Potential adversaries could use this trajectory to shorten the distance of an assault, reducing early warning times for attacks. Alaska's location therefore makes the state a critical component of the nation's ballistic missile defense system. It seems then, on every level, whether it be resources, logistics, or even national defense, Alaska has a lot of value, and we are likely to see a significant amount of change coming to the state in the next few decades.